Even though Pontius Pilate is a side character and not the main character of the New Testament, I would still consider him a biblical celebrity. Pontius Pilate is mentioned all the time in Christian circles. He's mentioned in the Apostles' Creed and in the Nicene Creed, and many churches all throughout the world quote those creeds each and every single Sunday in their church services. And if you've ever seen a Christian movie or TV show about the betrayal, arrest, trial, and crucifixion of Jesus Christ, Jesus and Pilate usually get the most screen time. In the gospel story, Pontius Pilate is the one responsible for sentencing Jesus to death by crucifixion. This is pretty much his only claim to fame. And if it weren't for the gospel accounts, pretty much nobody would know who Pontius Pilate was, unless you were a Roman or Jewish historian. You would think the life of such an important biblical figure would be well documented, but this is not the case for Pontius Pilate. There's a lot that historians just don't know about him. And in this video, I'd like to talk about what we do know about him. Our endeavor to uncover the historical facts about Pontius Pilate will be broken down into a 3-part video series. The first video, the video you're watching right now, will be all about Pontius Pilate through the eyes of the biblical authors. Who was Pontius Pilate in the Bible? The second video will be all about Pontius Pilate in non-biblical sources. So we'll be analyzing sources like Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, the Pilate Stone, Tacitus, and we'll even take a look at a few minted coins. Then in the third video, we'll take the biblical and non-biblical sources and put them together to see if we can create an accurate and historically reliable picture of Pontius Pilate. And also at the end of the third video, we'll take a look at how Pontius Pilate is actually a pretty controversial figure. He's a lot like Judas Iscariot in many ways, because there are endless debates over whether or not he is a good guy or a bad guy. Did he ever convert to Christianity or not? First and foremost, who was Pontius Pilate and how do we know? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are biblical and non-biblical sources about him. Let's start off with what the Bible has to say about him. The Bible mentions Pontius Pilate 55 times, although this can depend on what translation you are reading out of. And 55 times might sound like a lot, but considering the length of the entire Bible, 55 times is not very much. Pilate is mentioned in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and also in the book of Acts and the book of 1 Timothy. But that's it. That's 6 out of 27 New Testament books. And for those of you who like math, that's less than 25%. Different Gospels have different information about Pontius Pilate. Matthew has information that Mark doesn't have, and Luke has information that Matthew and Mark don't have, and so on. So I think a good way to start would be, what do all 4 Gospels say about Pontius Pilate? All of the Gospels would agree that Pilate was the Roman official that presided over the trial of Jesus Christ. And they would all agree that Pilate asked the Jews what crime he committed. Pilate asked Jesus if he was the king of the Jews, and Jesus answered, "You say that I am." All 4 Gospels would agree that Pilate asked the Jewish authorities if they wanted to release Barabbas, a known murderer and rioter, or Jesus. All 4 Gospels would agree that Joseph of Arimathea asks Pilate for the body of Jesus, and he grants him permission. And lastly, it's implied that Pilate believes Jesus is innocent, and Pilate, in all 4 Gospels, has a bit of hesitation before handing him over to be crucified. But the Gospels differ slightly in how they express his hesitation. For example, in Luke and John, Pilate is quoted as saying, "I have found no ground for the sentence of death," meaning that he thought Jesus was innocent. But Pilate does decide to hand over Jesus to be crucified because he's afraid of an angry mob forming. And this angry mob mentality is mentioned in all 4 Gospels. It's explicit in Matthew, Mark, and John, but implicit in Luke's Gospel. In Matthew and Mark, Pilate doesn't explicitly say he has found no cause for the sentence of death, but Matthew and Mark do imply that Pilate believed Jesus was innocent by saying, "For Pilate realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests had handed him over." And in Luke, it's Pilate and his wife that believe Jesus is innocent. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, Pilate's wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." So as you can see, there are some similarities between the gospel accounts in terms of what Pilate did and said. And actually, we already mentioned one, and that is that Matthew's gospel is the only gospel to mention Pontius Pilate's wife. Now, before I go too deep into the differences, I should probably say that by differences, I don't necessarily mean contradictions. Differences are okay, just like if you had a story told by 4 different people, they're gonna have differences. Historically, that's okay. So what are the differences? Only Matthew and Luke explicitly refer to Pilate as being a provincial governor. They use the word hegemonos, meaning provincial governor. And although this is technically a difference between the Gospels, it's pretty clear that Pilate is functioning as a Roman prefect. And yes, a Roman prefect is the correct title. You may have heard that Pontius Pilate was a Roman procurator, but he's actually a Roman prefect. Prefect and procurator are almost synonymous titles, especially given this time period and geographic location. But technically, it would be anachronistic to call Pontius Pilate a procurator, and I'll prove this in this second video in this series. Mark's description of Pilate is the shortest, much like everything else in Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel is the shortest Gospel with only 16 chapters. Matthew's description of Pilate is just a hair longer, but even still, we get some differences between these two Gospels. Matthew tells us that Barabbas was a notorious prisoner, but Mark, despite being shorter, surprisingly gives us more information on Barabbas. Mark tells us that Barabbas was in prison with the rebels who had committed murder during the insurrection. Mark just assumes that his audience knows what insurrection he's talking about, but for us living 2,000 years later, it's pretty difficult to know what insurrection is being referred to here. Now, this information was more about Barabbas than Pilate, but this information is still valuable to us because it gives us hints as to why Pilate may have been so hesitant to release Barabbas. Mark then finishes up his account of Jesus' trial before Pilate by telling us that Pilate asked the Jewish crowd if they wanted him to release Jesus or Barabbas. They yelled back, "Barabbas!" So then Pilate asks what he should do with Jesus, and they yell, "Crucify him!" Then Pilate asks them why. What evil has he done? But the crowd shouts back even louder, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, wanting to satisfy the crowd, released Barabbas, and after the flogging of Jesus, handed him over to be crucified. Matthew's Gospel includes the passage about Pilate's wife, which we already talked about, so I won't spend much time on that, but it has Pilate asking the crowd twice who he should release, Jesus or Barabbas. Then in Matthew's Gospel, Pilate asks the crowd what they should do with Jesus, and they shout, "Crucify him," just like in Mark's Gospel. But then in Matthew's Gospel, we are told that Pilate took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Pilate washing his hands in water is found in no other Gospel. So now on to Luke and John. These two Gospels are very different from each other and different from Matthew and Mark. Luke is the only Gospel writer that talks about Pontius Pilate outside of the context of Jesus' trial. Luke mentions in Luke 3:1 that in the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea and his brother Philip was reigning, it was during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas that the word of God came to John, son of Zebedee, in the wilderness. Luke is giving us this information to ground the John the Baptist story in history. So this is unique. No other gospel writer does this. Then Luke mentions Pilate again in chapter 13, verse 1, saying, "At that very time there was some present who told Jesus about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices." That's all he says about this particular situation, so it's not much. This is a strange story that's not attested in any other gospel or anywhere else in history, leading some scholars to question if it ever really happened. And this is a weird story. I mean, why would Pontius Pilate be in Jerusalem mixing dead Galilean Jewish human blood with the blood of animal sacrifices? There is some evidence outside of the Bible that could give us some hints as to why he might have been doing this, but no matter what you look at, this is a strange story. And really, the point of this story is clear when you read it in its entirety and in its proper context. Luke mentions this story for theological purposes, not historical purposes. Then beginning in Luke chapter 23, Luke discusses Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate, and we get some familiar stories, but also some new ones. Luke tells us that the high priests told Pilate that Jesus was perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor and calling himself the Messiah. This is only preserved in Luke's Gospel, and this is not found anywhere else. And as a matter of fact, there's nowhere else in the entire New Testament that even suggests that Jesus did not allow his followers to pay taxes to Rome. And just the opposite, actually. Jesus says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's." Then we quickly get another new story in Luke's Gospel. Luke tells us that when Pilate heard Jesus was a Galilean, he said that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction. So he sent Jesus off to Herod, who was in Jerusalem. Then we get the story about Jesus before Herod. Herod and his soldiers mock him and put an elegant robe on him and then send him back to Pilate. Then we get a small insertion into the text saying that on that day, Herod and Pilate became friends, and before this day, they were enemies. Why on earth would this make Herod and Pilate friends? Did they even talk to each other? The only explanation I've heard that makes any sense is that Herod was overjoyed with the fact that Pilate recognized his jurisdiction, and so they became friends. Despite these two explanations, it still seems strange that Herod and Pilate would become friends because of this scenario, but that's what Luke tells us. Pilate in Luke's gospel then doubles down and tells the chief priests and Jewish leaders that he found Jesus not guilty, and neither did Herod. Then we get yet another difference in Luke's gospel. Luke tells us that Pilate told the crowd that he would have Jesus flogged, then released. It seems strange to me that they would have an innocent man be flogged, considering Pilate and Herod both just said they found Jesus not guilty. But again, that's what Luke tells us. But in Luke, Pilate never actually has Jesus flogged and then released. Obviously, Jesus is crucified. Luke, along with Matthew and Mark, have Jesus flogged, then crucified, in that order. John's gospel does not have it in that order. Jesus is sent away to be flogged and then brought back, and then Pilate tries to convince the crowd to release him, but the crowd refuses. Which is a good segue that brings us to the longest and most different account of Jesus before Pontius Pilate, and that is found in the Gospel of John. In the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus and Pilate don't say much to each other. But in John's Gospel, Jesus and Pilate are talking up a storm. In John's Gospel, we get the famous lines that Jesus says to Pilate, and they are almost always in Christian movies and TV shows. But these lines are only found in John's Gospel and nowhere else in the Bible. These famous sayings include, when Jesus tells Pilate, "My kingdom is not from this world. I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Then Pilate's famous response is, "What is truth?" Also only found in John's Gospel is the crown of thorns being put on Jesus' head with a purple robe, and then Jesus going back to Pilate and standing before the crowd again. Then the Jews tell Pilate that they have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he claimed to be the Son of God. John tells us that this made Pilate more afraid than ever. Then Pilate took Jesus into his headquarters and again started questioning him. These questions are only found in John's Gospel. Jesus tells Pilate that he has no power over him unless given from above, and he says the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. This point is made in all four Gospel accounts, and that is that Pilate should not be blamed for the death of Jesus, but the Jews and the Jewish high priests should be blamed for his death. We will come back to this point in just a minute, and it will be a major topic in the third video in this video series because it is very indicative of how early Christians viewed Pontius Pilate. Then again, only in John's Gospel do we get this little tidbit of information, and that is that Pilate had an inscription made and put over the cross of Jesus, saying, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." And this was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. The Jews complained to Pilate about this, but Pilate answers, "What I have written, I have written." So that's what we know about Pilate from the Gospel accounts. And we do know about Pilate from the book of Acts and the book of 1 Timothy, but the book of Acts and the book of 1 Timothy doesn't give us any new information about Pilate that can't be found in the Gospel accounts. They tell us that Pilate presided over the trial of Jesus Christ and that Pilate condemned him to death by crucifixion. And actually, the book of Acts isn't a separate source, because the person who wrote the Gospel of Luke also wrote the book of Acts. Acts is the sequel to Luke. It's Luke 2.0, so to speak. But Luke, in the book of Acts, doubles down again and makes clear that everyone knows that Pontius Pilate is not responsible for the death of Jesus, but it's the Jews. The Jews killed the author of life, according to the book of Acts. So by now you can see that the biblical authors are making a strong case that Pontius Pilate shouldn't be blamed for the death of Jesus. But as good historians, we have to ask the question, why? Why are the gospel writers going out of their way to make sure Pilate isn't blamed for Jesus' death? This seems kind of strange. Well, we have to remember that Judea was a Roman province, and by the time the Gospels were written, Christians were facing extreme amounts of persecution. Many Christians were being killed for their faith, especially in the Roman Empire under the Roman Emperor Nero. So if we want to follow good historical scholarship, we have to read between the lines and try and see, why is it that the gospel writers seem to be kissing up to the Romans so much? Why did they go out of their way to prove that Pontius Pilate was innocent? What's going on here? Is Pilate really as innocent as the gospel writers lead us to believe? We have to remember that the gospels were written between 35 and 65 years after Jesus was already dead, and so persecution of Christians was already running rampant in the Roman Empire. So some scholars believe that some bias made its way into the gospel accounts. Many scholars believe that the gospel writers did two things. One, only choose to give information about Pilate that emphasized his innocence and left out information that would make Pilate seem guilty. Or perhaps the gospel writers even fabricated stories about Pontius Pilate to make him appear less guilty, like in Matthew, the story about his wife and Pilate washing his hands. There would certainly be environmental pressure from the Romans to get the gospel writers to do this. They wanted to get their message out there, but they also didn't want to die. Rome's policy was promote Rome or face the consequences. But ultimately, I'll leave that decision up to you. Let me know in the comment section what you think. Do you think the gospel writers purposefully made Pilate look better than he really was to avoid persecution? Or do you think the gospel writers were giving us good, historical, reliable information about Pontius Pilate? Let me know what you think. So that's all we know about Pontius Pilate from the Bible, which isn't much. We still don't know when he was born, when he died. We don't know anything about his family, how he came to power. Was he involved in the Roman military? How involved was he in Roman politics? How long did he govern in Judea? None of that. We just don't know that information from the biblical account. To help us answer those questions, we have to look outside of the Bible. Within the first 100 years after the death of Jesus, there's actually quite a few sources talking about Pontius Pilate. We have sources like the Pilate Stone, Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, Tacitus, and even coins that Pilate minted. There's even more sources, but technically they're not very good sources, but I'll mention them here just in case you are interested and want to study on your own, and that would be the Gospel of Peter and the letter to the Trallians and the letter to the Smyrnaeans by Ignatius of Antioch. I would look at those sources with a grain of salt, but they are sources from the early to mid 2nd century, and so they are fascinating, but they likely got their information from the Gospels themselves, and so doesn't represent a unique, authentic, new source for Pontius Pilate. If you are thirsty for more knowledge and are interested in learning more about Pontius Pilate from outside of the Bible, I have made a part 2 video. And if you're from the future, you can watch this video by clicking right here. And if you're not from the future, you'll have to watch this random video, at least for now.